Well, first of all, I think it's a very good debate to have, and we all need to completely understand the challenges that are facing public finances, and underlying the approach that the government takes to public finances is a strategic call that we have made, that we don't believe that the increases in the tax burden that we've seen in the last few years should become irreversible, and we do think we should make the efforts to bring down the tax burden, because we look around the world and we think that the countries that grow the fastest tend to have lower tax burdens, although economists will argue about cause and correlation. But then that means that you have to look at the fact that we have a 1% increase, real terms increase, in our spending plan for the next Parliament. That was brought in the autumn statement of 22, when I had to do a very big consolidation, and that included putting up taxes and also reducing spending. That was the reducing spending bit of it. And the question that people like the IFS rightly ask is that sustainable? And I think the two things I would say to that is, first of all, we did reduce spending in real terms in 2010 by 2.1% a year, and in the spending review of 2014, I think it was reduced by 0.7% a year. So it not just can be done, it has been done. But the question is, can you do it without cuts to public services that are valued by the public? And I think the answer to that is only if you have a productivity revolution in the way public services are delivered. And in this, there seems to be a divide in politics between people who have experience of the private sector, who say that the level of productivity increase that we're asking of public services is completely reasonable. I'm in this camp. Public services are, I think, 5.9% lower than pre-pandemic at the moment. I look at the period between 2010 and 2019, when the average increase in productivity was 0.7% in the public services. And the NHS increased productivity by 1.5%. And what we're asking for is for public services to increase their productivity by about 2% in the next Parliament. I think that is completely doable. I think most people with any kind of private sector background would say that is much lower than they are aiming for. But I think those of us who've worked in the public sector, including I think probably everyone here today, would say it's more challenging in the public sector. You have to be prepared to invest in new IT systems, which is what happens in the private sector, and you have to see those through to make sure that you end up with cashable savings, not just productivity savings that are allowing for better use of public servants' time. But I think with determination and imagination it's possible, and that was what I tried to set out in the budget.
That's great, sort of setting the scene. Can I come back to the issue of debt and the fiscal rules? So the OBR says that you're going to meet that target. Debt will rise and then fall in the final year as a percentage of GDP, and it conditions its fiscal forecast on the tax take rising to near record highs, although I'm reading here, including through planned increases in fuel duty that have not in practice been implemented since 2011. It also assumes the government will stick to assumptions which imply no real growth in public spending per person over the next 5 years. So if you're accepting that you're going to meet the rule on debt, are you accepting those assumptions? I'm just trying to work out how this all fits together, given what you've just said.
Well, we are accepting the spending assumption, which is overall public spending going up by 1% in real terms a year over the next Parliament. Because we've recently had big increases in migration caused by exceptional decisions to support people rightly in Ukraine, Hong Kong and Afghanistan. The per capita number is slightly lower, but it's effectively flat real, as the OBR said. So yeah, I accept that, and that's why there's a big productivity challenge. On fuel duty, I know people call it a fiction. I don't accept that, actually. it's a decision that we take at every budget. Look, I can be quite open with you and say, I hope if I do another fiscal event this Parliament, and indeed if I'm return as Chancellor after the next election in the spring budget, I would hope to continue to freeze fuel duty, but I would take that decision on the basis of public finances at the time and whether I can afford to do it. But it's not something that's been pre-decided. So I think the public accounts correctly reflect that decision.
And what about the spending on other areas? I mean, do you see that growing in real terms? And I'm just looking here about, because there's a lack of detailed department by department spending plans, I'm reading again, beyond the current spending review. And that's why it all becomes a bit difficult to see how this all adds up. So what is spending going to be doing over the course of the next Parliament? Can you just talk us through it?
I don't think it is difficult. I mean, it's perfectly, with great respect, it's perfectly normal for governments. I mean, no governments decide a spending review this far ahead of when that spending review is happening. This particular spending review has to be complete before next April, when the next financial year starts. And of course, if the general election is in October, that will mean it's very, very tight. And that is why we're thinking in advance about the most important element of that spending review, which is the productivity element. How do we have more productive public services? What upfront investment do we need so that we don't have cuts in the services that are valued by the public? We have a more productive state, not a bigger state. That's very important. But I think it's, something that, of course, is going to have challenges, but I think it's perfectly reasonable assumptions.
Okay, well, so we're going to come on and tease out some of these points. Lord Griffiths, do you want to pick up on fiscal rule?
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Chancellor and Treasury officials. I think most people accept that there's a case for fiscal rules. But I don't think, in my career, I've never known such hostility in the criticism you get from reputable institutions like the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I just wondered, how do you reflect on the fiscal rules that we have?
I think it's very important to have fiscal rules. They are guardrails which give people confidence that that chancellors are taking decisions with the long-term interests of the economy, particularly things like the level of debt, in mind. But in practice, as many people around this table know, they are very, very difficult to get right. And the choice you have is rather tighter fiscal rules than the ones we've got now, which end up being broken, or slightly looser fiscal rules as we have now that you stick to. And the fiscal rules that we have now were put in place in the autumn of 22 when we faced a big economic crisis, largely caused by the invasion of Ukraine, but also the aftermath of the pandemic. And we gave ourselves 5 years, not 3 years, which is what happened previously. And the reason we did that, which I think all those bodies supported at the time, was because we didn't want to have a debt rule that forced an even bigger consolidation, which ended up putting the economy into a spiral of decline because it affected growth so badly. So giving myself 5 years, not 3 years, enabled us, I think, to avoid a serious recession. We've had a technical recession, but to avoid a serious recession. But it also had an unexpected consequence, which I didn't realise at the time, which is that by having a 5-year horizon, you allow the OBR to do much more dynamic forecasting. So they have done in the last 18 months something they've never done before, which is taken the national insurance cuts and said this is actually going to mean that in 5 years' time there'll be 200,000 more full-time equivalents in work, filling 1 in 5 vacancies. Now, they've never been able to model the impact of things like tax cuts or full expensing, which was the business tax cut in the autumn. And that, I think, has encouraged long-term decision-making, because when I'm thinking about what to do, one of the first questions I ask is, what will be the GDP impact in 5 years' time? And I think that's a healthy thing. So there's no perfect fiscal rules, but I think, on balance, the ones we have at the moment are sensible.
Can I say, I think you make a very good case for, in a way, gradualism rather than something tougher, shorter. On the other hand, at the end of the period, the ratio of debt to income is still, 95% or something like that. And when I think of previous chancellors who've had to take decisions when there seems to be a structural imbalance in the public finances, Roy Jenkins back in the 60s, Dennis Healey in the mid-70s, Geoffrey Howe in the early 80s, they all actually had to introduce very tough measures to deal with it. And I'm impressed by the fact that there are two countries in Europe which do have a much lower ratio of debt to income than ourselves or France or the US and so on, namely Switzerland at 45% and Germany at 65%. And I just wonder, even in terms of the public, whether there isn't a case for saying, look, we can go for gradualism, but we're in potentially such trouble because of the uncertain environment in which we live. We really have to announce something which will be credible but very tough.
I think what happens, look, it's exactly the right question to ask, but I think the challenge you have is that the very tough thing that you announce, which would presumably either be a steep increase in tax or a steep cut in spending, would have a very big impact on our growth rate. And the question then is whether actually our debt to GDP ratio would end up being higher rather than lower as a result of the impact of those changes. So there is this balance that you have. And I think that it's also the case that whilst Switzerland and Germany are, in that sense, shining examples of fiscal prudence, we are the second lowest in the G7. Yes. So we're actually not bad compared to the majority of other countries. I would say the answer to your question really lies in whether the money that you are investing, some of which may come from borrowing, is actually being spent on things that increase the long-run productive capacity of the economy, or whether it's being spent on current consumption. If it's being spent on things that in the long run are going to help the economy and help the supply side of the economy, then there is a case for doing it within sensible guardrails. If not, I think you're taking very big risks with the sustainability of public finances.
Thank you.
Just a quick one. I took you to say that the fiscal rules that you set when you became Chancellor, in effect, were the product of the circumstances at the time. You're sort of telling us now things are very different. Does that mean that you need to revisit the fiscal rule?
I think they were a product of the time, but I think it's really dangerous for chancellors to change fiscal rules at every fiscal event. I think the criticisms that are levelled at the fiscal rules, some people say they're too loose and there isn't a path to bringing down debt sustainably, and other people say they're too tight and they're not allowing enough investment for growth. And I actually think both of those criticisms can be managed by sensible budget decisions within the fiscal rules that we have. So, for example, the £3.5 billion that we're investing in NHS productivity, that is additional investment in our productive capacity, and it's very important we're able to do that within the current fiscal rules. We're also bringing down debt by the fifth year. So I think that's the balance, really. Oh yeah, could I bring in Sam Beckett?
I was just going to add that although the fiscal rules are obviously an incredibly important part of the fiscal framework, we have been thinking about other aspects of sustainability and transparent reporting. So we're increasingly publishing a wider range of metrics, including public sector net worth. We've published a document on contingent liabilities for the first time. And of course, the Office for Budget Responsibility does that longer term projection piece very transparently every summer, looking at fiscal sustainability in the longer run. So those things sit alongside the rules to assure us that we are thinking about sustainability.
Do you think that the fixation on a pure percentage is just too blunt?
I think the pairing of rules that we've got, looking at borrowing and debt, are, if you go back over different sets of fiscal rules, that is generally the way we've looked at targets. Those are easily measurable and judged by the Office for Budget Responsibility. But I think that wider set of metrics is important to have on the radar to see if there are other things going on in the background that you need to attend to.
Very good. Maybe you could just write to us about what, I don't want to go into too much detail now, but it's very interesting what other sets of metrics you're looking at actually on this.
The principal one is the public sector net worth,
Right.
which is that broadest measure.
Is there anything else you briefly want to mention before we move on?
The contingent liabilities piece I mentioned as well. We've published a document on that which summarises those.
Excellent. Okay, very good. We'll move on. That's a nice segue into Lord Burns.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chancellor. I understand the case for having a 5-year horizon as you make it, and I understand the worries too about being too tough and the case that Sam makes for looking at a range of indicators. But one definition of debt sustainability is that we should be in a position to absorb shocks when they arise. We've just had the experience of a whole series of unexpected shocks which has taken the debt ratio up by really a huge amount. Given that and the change that we've seen in the debt structure, do you have any nervousness about starting from this point, at 100, getting up towards that? Are you assuming that as long as we stay with the pack of other major countries, in a sense there is some defence there should another event take place, or do you also think, do you have any nervousness about this and the concerns of where we would be? Should we be trying to get the debt ratio down faster?
I think we are getting the balance right, because the priority right now has to be, if we want to get the debt ratio down, to get back to our normal trend growth rate of about 2%, where we haven't been for the last couple of years. And so I think further consolidation at this point would make that harder, and ultimately would mean that the debt picture would look more worrying, not less worrying. But I think your broader point is right. For example, the very difficult decisions taken between 2010 and 2018 that brought down the deficit by about 80% were a very important foundation for us being able to give, I think, £360 billion of support during the pandemic. And I think the bigger reason why it's right that we should always be challenged with questions like yours is that one of the biggest reasons for the consolidation that we had in the autumn of 2022 was the hike in interest rates that was caused by 11% inflation. And, it is entirely possible that could happen again. And we have to look at the world around us and the potential for shocks and recognise that that is a very real risk going forward. So I think it is, that's a very good reason for having fiscal rules that have credibility and ultimately allow you to bring down debt credibly.
Anyone else want to come in? Lord Blackwell.
Yeah, Chancellor. I'd like to ask both about short-term and long-term spending policies. In the short term, I mean the current spending review, the IFS has commented that your plans would be devilishly difficult to deliver. They point out that maintaining expenditure on the areas which are committed, they estimate would mean other areas of expenditure would have to reduce by 2.5% roughly in real terms each year. You talked about possibilities to increase productivity, which I certainly endorse, but that takes time. Do you think the opportunity to increase productivity, does that mean that some of the existing commitment areas can be revisited, or does it all fall on the unprotected areas? And are you comfortable telling the public that this can be achieved without a return to austerity type cuts?
Look, I don't pretend that 2.5% real terms cuts, which is the IFS modelling, it's not the government's modelling, but if those numbers were correct, I don't pretend that would not be challenging. But I would say that the budget, I announced an agreement with the NHS, which is our biggest public service, which is 40% of all spending on public services, in which they said that they would deliver over the next Parliament 1.9% productivity improvements a year. That would mean that you would eliminate the vast majority of that 2.5% real terms cuts, providing those savings were cashable savings. And that is a big challenge, but I think it is deliverable if you know that is your focus from the outset. And that's why I announced that the Treasury is going to take a very different approach to the spending review next time round, because we're going to be looking for product ways, and we're asking the whole of the public sector how they're going to deliver that 2%, and we're going to be looking for specifically for things that make that a cashable saving. So I fully accept that it will be challenging. I don't think it's by any means impossible, and I think there are lots of examples of not just the private sector, but I think if you look in the public sector where, things that we weren't able to think about in 2010, such as the IT revolution, are possible now. If you look at the transformation in the passport office over just the last year, where they've reduced the time it takes to get a new passport from 10 weeks to 3 weeks, and it's, I think, probably one of the most efficient passport services in the world. They've done it by simply applying the things that happen in every other realm of our lives when we're in the online world to the process of buying a passport. Now, if we could do that in, for example, if doctors were able to not have to spend so much time at the end of the day filling out medical notes, which the NHS is very optimistic they can find a way of translating a voice message from a doctor into an entry into patients' notes. These things have real potential, and we should be going for them full tilt.
Is it realistic then, within those constraints, to think about making progress on increasing defence spending over the next few years?
I think we will need to increase defence spending. We've committed to raising it to 2.5% of GDP as soon as it's affordable. I think it's impossible to look at the world around us and say that it's not becoming significantly more dangerous. And so that is definitely something that we need to continue to keep under review.
Okay, and if you go beyond the next Parliament, the OBR projects, because of demographic changes and cost of care and pension, etc., that assuming historic growth rates, public expenditure would end up at 67% of GDP in 50 years' time, which implies taxes also at that level, which is clearly not desirable. Do you think it is possible to reduce that to acceptable levels through the kind of productivity improvements you've talked about? I mean, and high growth rates. Both you and the opposition talk about boosting economic growth, but you'd need economic growth to be 1% higher every year to keep public spending back at around 40% of GDP. it goes back to the question Lord Bridges asked, are we really being open, both government and opposition, about the challenges of constraining public expenditure over that time period?
I think I genuinely think we're being completely transparent. We're laying out a plan. That's not to say that it's not a challenging plan to deliver, but I think I'm very clear on what the plan is. Let me tell you in both of those areas. So if we increase productivity growth in the public sector by 0.5% a year above current levels, so if you take the 2010 to 2019 period, which is a bit more normal than the period we've had in the last few years, it was growing at 0.7% a year. So if it grew 1.2% a year going forward, not 0.7% a year, that is enough to stabilise public spending as a proportion of GDP. But if you then add to that all the policies that we want to do to get the private sector growing faster, for example, our policies to make work pay so that we get more of the around 6 million adults of working age who are not in work, if you exclude students, into the workforce. Our inactivity rate's about 21.9%. In Iceland, it's 13%, and in Netherlands, it's 14%. So if you look at the kind of policies other countries that are not completely dissimilar to us have, there are big things you can do there. If you look at our policies to increase investment by the private sector with the full expensing tax break that we announced, if you look at our nurturing of the technology sector, which I think is going to be a great opportunity for the UK going forward, I think it's absolutely possible to get our economic growth rate healthily closer to US levels of growth compared to continental European levels of growth.
Great. Before we move on, just returning briefly to defence, Chancellor, if we may. Are you willing to, you say we're working to a plan, and I see that's what the Defence Secretary is also saying, given that he says, quotes, we're in a pre-war world. Are you able then, given the importance of this, to put a time frame around when we're going to get to 2.5%? And second, just a question, whether you think that's sufficient, because I know that when you were standing to become leader of the Conservative Party, you were saying that you wanted it to be 3%. Indeed, I've got here a quote from James Heapy back in October 2022, when you and the Defence Secretary, then Ben Wallace, were meeting, where it says, he said, the Chancellor and Secretary of State Ben Wallace have had some initial conversations in which I think everybody is clear that 3% by the end of the decade is necessary given the security situation that we're in. So do you think that 2.5% is going to be enough?
So I know defence is one of your 4 Ds, Mr. Chair, and one of the misfortunes of being Chancellor, having campaigned for the leadership of the party and spent some time on the backbenches, is that your views are known to everyone. And I would say this, I think there is absolutely no doubt that we need to spend more on defence. And I would also put it another way, just thinking back to the time I spent as Foreign Secretary. If you were going to say what is the biggest single way that the rest of the world thinks that the UK can add value to the world, we do amazing work on global security, amazing work on international development, all sorts of areas, but actually it is our work with the United States to maintain the peace that we have done since 1945 that is the single most important thing we have done for global peace and prosperity, and the single biggest thing that other countries look to the United Kingdom to do. And we are lucky to have very, very fine armed forces. So I think it's a very important area. I do think that and now perhaps I'm putting my Chancellor hat back on, it's important not to start with how much money you're going to spend. It's important to ask what you're going to get for any additional investment. And I think that it's very clear that if you look at what's happened in Ukraine, the nature of modern warfare has changed very dramatically. We need to think about that. And I think we also need to ask whether our defence procurement is up to scratch, because we seem to have a lot of projects where we decide to do something that's going to be delivered in 10 years' time that ends up costing massively more than everyone originally said it was going to cost, and sometimes is not the best suited for the new types of warfare, drones and ships without crew and tanks without drivers and all these kinds of things that you're seeing now in modern warfare. So I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to happen, but if you're asking me if I agree that we will need to spend more, I do.
Sorry, just to press you very gently on the time frame.
Well, let me say this: we're keeping it under review. We are very cognizant of the fact that even in the last year, you see a very big change, which is that the war in Ukraine that people had hoped would come to a rapid end seems to be something that could last much longer. And with the US presidential elections, there could be further change. So we have to keep thinking about these things very hard.
Thank you for that. That's sort of a segue. Lord Davies.
Yes, just continuing on the issue of productivity, I think your figures depend to a significant extent on the public sector productivity programme, including all the work in the health service, and it's going to cost 3.4 billion, and it's going to generate 35 billion over the next 5 years, which sounds fantastic value for money. I can't help wondering why this wasn't because it's
why this wasn't
why isn't it happening anyway? What's the additional? Why isn't the health service doing these things anyway? Because they're patently obvious things that you ought to do. And is that figure in addition to what would have happened anyway? There seems to be a big sort of
very
all there.
Very good question. Questions, plural. First of all, the health service is recovering from the biggest shock that it's had in its history with the pandemic. And so this is a moment of change for the health service when it changes its priorities and gets back onto a normal footing. Now, when I became Health Secretary in 2012, they were in the middle of something called the Nicholson Challenge, run by the former Chief Executive of the Health Service, Sir David Nicholson, who set the health service the challenge of making £20 billion of savings over 4 or 5 years. And that was a big part of what they were doing then. That delivered the 1.5% improvement in productivity that happened during my period as Health Secretary. And so we need to get back into that normal way of doing. So that's the reason why it's not started before. Are those savings on top? Broadly, yes, because it's because we were prepared to invest the 3.4 billion in the IT transformation and the NHS long-term workforce plan that the Chief Executive of the NHS was willing to publicly commit to 1.9% productivity improvements for the next 5 years. She wouldn't have made that commitment unless we had made the commitment on the part of government. But it's important to say that the productivity improvements that she's committed to are not just about waiting for some fancy IT system to get inaugurated in 3 years' time. She is committed that every large NHS body, including every hospital, will measure its productivity on a quarterly basis, and that will become a central part of how managers throughout the NHS are assessed, and that process is going to start right away.
Yeah. To what extent is the Treasury reflective about the sheer problem of measuring productivity in public services, particularly in the health service? There's the general problem of measuring it, which has always been there, but now with the use of electronic devices preeminently, maybe with now measuring the wrong thing?
I think it's a really good question. It's actually a big challenge for the private sector too. I think most people would question whether our use of electronic diaries, for example, which we all use now, is actually reflected in national productivity figures. So there's a private sector issue there too. I think what Treasury officials would say, but I've got two eminent ones here, is that we think that we are better than most countries at measuring public sector productivity. We do measure the outputs of our public services, like our schools. Our GDP goes down when teachers are on strike. In most countries, it doesn't go down because they just measure the input in terms of the teachers' salaries paid. But I'm sure there's a lot of improvements we still need to make. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Sam.
We've actually, certainly, and we've got a programme ongoing with the Office for National Statistics to try and improve the measurement of public sector productivity. As the Chancellor says, we're pretty good at this in international terms. A lot of countries, it's still, fixed inputs equal outputs, so productivity is fixed. Whereas in the UK, we've got much more sophisticated measurement than that. I mean, the two really big areas where I think we are leading edge are in education and health, but there's always more that can be done, and I think things have changed as well coming out of the pandemic, so it's time to look again at those measurements. One of the things the ONS can do for us that we're talking to them about now is give us more up-to-date measures of public sector productivity, so as we can look at progress over time without big time lags. So we've got a good ongoing work programme with the ONS on this.
And to argue the contrary case, we're really interested in the extent to which it changes rather than its absolute level.
Absolutely, yeah.
Baroness Wolf.
Yes, Chancellor, thank you for coming. I'd like to change tack slightly to the topic of migration, and obviously inward and outward migration has a major impact on our societies. And the OBR modelled a number of scenarios and very reasonably drew a clear difference between effect on GDP per person and GDP overall and the impact of whether or not we had capital investment. But I was also struck by the fact that most of the scenarios do in fact assume a pretty high level of migration, net inward migration over the next Parliament. And I was also struck by the fact that in your recent changes to legal migration rules, although you raise thresholds in a number of ways, skilled worker visas, for example, you still left it pretty easy to come in if you were a care worker or a teacher. And you also still have the desire for 600,000 international students. So my question really is, on the whole, do you feel that our growth does depend on high levels of net migration, not merely total GDP, but GDP per person? Is this something which, given the nature of our economy, we really need?
I think that it is definitely the case that migration has contributed significantly to our growth in GDP over many decades, but particularly during the period that we were in the single market. But I think it's a much harder question to answer if you ask about GDP per head, which is a much more important metric because that is more closely linked to rises in living standards for ordinary families. And I think that some controlled migration, filling skills gaps, can have a very important role in increasing GDP per head. But the risk you have is that if you end up with a model that is dependent on unlimited migration, you end up undermining the growth in GDP per head and also creating a lot of social unrest. So what I believe we should do is to say as a country, which I tried to outline in the budget, that we are going to move decisively towards a high-skill, high-wage economic model which does not depend on unlimited migration. And the OBR modelling of migration patterns, although it's 670,000 as the last annual number, they actually have it falling pretty quickly down to the long-term ONS rate of 315,000 a year. So they think that the levels of migration will fall. But if you want a model that is high wage, high skilled, there are some things that you can do relatively quickly. But the real thing you need to do, I think, is to invest in education and training. You need to invest in the skills of the 50% who don't go to university. The Prime Minister is very keen on maths to 18. You need to have an apprenticeship programme that is as good as the ones in Germany and Switzerland and Singapore. And then you start to really increase productivity and living standards.
Thank you. I would say that if you were thinking about high-skill migration, care workers is perhaps not the one that would immediately come to mind.
No, I
so
agree.
It does feel as if we are still basically responding to short-term gaps. But clearly you can't give a precise answer to this, but what has also been true is that it's been quite hard to predict the impact of changes, and hence we've had sudden switches. As a sort of rough ballpark figure, at what point do you feel that the level of net migration is sort of getting so high in terms of its impact on things where we clearly have a shortage like housing that you go, we really need to change this? I mean, if I push you for that.
I don't think I can give an exact number, but I do think it's too high now. And perhaps I could just clarify my earlier comments. So I recognise that there are going to be short-term gaps for things like care workers, where we are going to need to show some flexibility in our migration policy in order to make sure that we address the needs of the social care sector. But that is, the journey we need to go on is going to take time. If you're talking about raising the education levels and skill levels of school leavers, that is not something that happens overnight. And so, there is going to be a combination of filling in short-term gaps, but also putting in place the longer-term policies that reduce your dependence on high levels of migration.
Also, during the debate on your budget, I mean, I've noticed that doing international comparisons, you've been very eager to compare our total GDP growth rate with other countries, and I noticed that almost immediately the opposition put to you that if you do this in terms of GDP per head, you don't get the same conclusion. Where does the truth lie, do you think, between these two numbers? I mean, I think surely you've got to take account of the growth of the population. On the other hand, not all heads are the same because of demographic changes. And I don't know if this, for Sam, but what's your response to this debate? Because I've now heard it several times.
I think the truth lies, the truth really depends on what question you're trying to answer. So when I talk about the fact that we've had higher growth than France, Germany, Italy, Japan since 2010, what I'm really saying there is that if you take a period in which we've had huge global shocks, financial crisis, pandemic, energy crisis, all in the space of 15 years, I think we've had a very impressive overall performance to see the economy growing by faster than many of our peers. If you're talking about how we improve living standards for ordinary families, all over the world they've been affected particularly since the financial crisis, and our GDP per head has risen. I mean, I can give you countries: France, Finland, Norway, Netherlands, Canada. A lot of similar countries, our GDP per head has risen faster, but we're middle of the pack overall. And I would like us to embrace economic reforms, which is what I was outlining in the budget, that mean that we have a higher rate of GDP per head, and that's partly moving to a different model with respect to migration, which is what we were talking about with Baroness Wolf.
Can I just ask, sorry, just to pick you up on this point, Chancellor, about you said it will take time. I understand exactly why you're saying that in your argument, but so when you look into the next Parliament, and let's assume the next Parliament lasts a full 5 years, do you think by the end of the next Parliament we should still see net migration at 315,000? Do you think that's an optimal, satisfactory level for us to be at in that? Because that's several years off.
I don't want to get drawn on what an optimal or satisfactory level is. I think it's too high now. But to answer your question about the end of the next Parliament, I mean, if we're talking about raising living standards, which is the key objective of economic policy, the economists around the table will know that the key thing is productivity. And what are the key drivers of productivity? Well, it's investment in plant and machinery and IT, which is what our capital allowances will do. I think that will definitely have an effect by the end of the next Parliament. It's investment in human capital. Again, I think the education reforms and the rise we've seen in reading standards over the last decade, I think they definitely have some impact over a 5-year period. And then it's what economists call total factor productivity, but it's things like the amount of innovation in the economy. I think we've actually got a very strong story to tell there with our innovation industries. So I think you could start to see an improvement in our growth rate that is translating through into higher living standards absolutely by the end of the next Parliament.
Okay, let me just try again. What is stopping you from saying that it might be better if net migration was in the region of 100 to 200,000? I'm just trying to get the sense of, because this obviously has a bearing when you look at the OBR's scenarios on debt sustainability, on growth, and as you well know. So I'm just trying to get a sense, because obviously this is a very important issue out in the country, and people are very interested to know what you think about that.
I think the reason I don't want to give you an answer on that is because I think the answer would depend on a lot of very variable assumptions about the structure of the economy that you were talking about. So you could have a structure where you had, very high skills available domestically, and your immigration needs were really for low-skill labour, which you were happy to have because people at home were all doing high-wage, high-skill jobs, or you could have a situation in which we had failed to do that and you were still bringing in lots of people with higher skills. So I just don't think it's possible to land on a single number.
Okay, well, we'll move on then to very neatly to Lord Lamont and inactivity.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. You referred earlier to the proportion of the population of working age that were not available for work. You put a figure, I think, of 6 million, or another figure is 9 million, including students. And you also referred earlier, when talking to Lord Griffiths, to the measures in the budget that you said over the survey period had created the equivalent of 200,000 full-time jobs. That is, of course, significant and impressive, but 200,000 as a figure is, of course, dwarfed by the totality of the problem. And when you look at the number of people claiming sickness benefit, which has gone from 2.5 million to 3 million, and it is said 2/3 of them saying that they suffer from mental and behavioural disorders, this is a very serious problem. What can the government do further about that? Because the sort of tax measures you've done, admirable though they are really touching the fringe of the problem.
Yes, I think that's a very fair challenge. The 200,000 number is actually low compared to the 2.8 million who are on sickness benefit. But it's quite a significant chunk of the 900,000 odd vacancies in the economy. So I think what we're basically trying to do is to make sure that we can fill vacancies by making work pay. And I think the national insurance cuts and the childcare reforms and the back to work reforms that the Work and Pension Secretary has already announced do go some way to doing that. But I think there's a lot more work to do. I absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the particular challenges that we have is that at the moment, the welfare system identifies mental health challenges as a reason why someone should not be asked to look for work. But I think there will be cases when actually not being in the workplace is detrimental to people's mental health, and it will be much better for those individuals if they were supported to live with their mental health condition in a way that allowed them to work. And that is a very big change. And the reforms we've announced so far reduce the number of people who are over 5 years who are told that they don't need to look for work because they're too ill by about 2/3. But there is still a very, very big challenge there.
Do you think the structure of benefits is something that should be looked at? I think the OBR suggested that perhaps the level of sickness benefit relative to other benefits might have an influence on people's perception of themselves, and they referred to certain benefit changes that have occurred in previous decades, comparing one benefit to another, that might have an impact. Is that on your thinking, on your radar?
It is absolutely. And I think we do need to keep looking at welfare reform, because I think it is incredibly destructive to society if inadvertently and for all the right reasons a system ends up parking people outside the world of work. And we need to be very alive to the risks of that. And, you know, that is partly sickness, but it's also partly barriers like parents not being able to work because of the cost of childcare, older people coming to the view that they need to retire early, maybe in their 50s, because of the tax incentives around pensions. There's a whole range of things. But I think when it comes to welfare, there are some very particular issues that we need to keep thinking about how we can reform.
Okay. Aren't you having to... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to add, I mean, partly to address some of the things that you were talking about, as the Chancellor said, where the gateway to get onto the higher levels of benefits that you get if you're judged to have no ability to work or even to look for work, that is being tightened, and that was driving the point the Chancellor made about reducing the flows into that group by 2/3. But also there was quite a substantial amount of funding provided in terms of mental health support, so talking therapies for those with mild or moderate conditions, increase the number of people that will be benefiting from that by nearly 400,000 over the next 5 years, but also people who have more severe mental health conditions. There's individual support placements, I think they're called, which is intensive support for people with employment where they have more severe mental health conditions, to try and address the disincentive from a health perspective, as well as tighten the gateway to getting to the point of not having any requirements in the first place.
Just widening the question to the whole question of the labour market, aren't you having to fly blind with the deficiencies in the ONS statistics? I mean, in October last year, they suspended their monthly figures. They reintroduced them in February this year, and then they said there were certain problems with them. This, I notice, led Frank Giles in the Financial Times to say that you were flying blind. You couldn't tell whether the labour market was tightening or loose. You couldn't tell whether the effect of tax cuts was actually to increase or decrease people going into the labour market.
I think it is true, and maybe I'll bring in Sam on this point, that it is, given the problems the ONS have been having, it is probably challenging for the OBR to plot the exact labour market impact of individual measures the government announces. But I think the scale of the problem is so big that I don't think we should hang around for better statistics before trying to tackle it. I don't know, Sam, whether you'd add anything to that.
Yes, I mean, it sounds very much like we're all very cognizant of what happened with the labour market statistics. The labour force survey, in fact, they reached a point of survey response, which was, I think, round about 17% or something, and at that point they felt they had to withdraw the statistics for a period. This is a common factor across different countries. These long door-to-door surveys, I think people are less and less willing to participate in them. So in the background, I mean, obviously it has created a problem with the quality of the statistics. The ONS has put in place a good recovery plan. They've boosted the survey size. They've got quite a good response to that. And we are, keep working with them and keeping a close eye on what they're now terming their experimental statistics. It's had a sort of a change to its status. That's the old labour force survey kind of recovery plan. They are going to bring online, hopefully this year, around September time, I think was the plan, but not yet kind of announced definitely, a whole new kind of multimodal way of engaging with surveying the population on their labour market characteristics. So this is going to be a much better survey. It's always been waiting to take over, but unfortunately, you know, the problem hit with the big drop-off in the response in the old survey before the new one was ready to bring online. But something we're watching closely, obviously challenging at a time when you'd really want to know very accurately what was going on. But I think the ONS have done what they can to stabilise the situation and triangulate information to give a decent picture.
There are also other timely sources of data like HMRC's real-time information, which is the collection of from the collection of taxes. They know how many people are employed by each employer at a given time, and that information is also made available to both the ONS and the OBR when they're doing their forecasts.
Thank you very much.
And I just, before we move on to another D of decarbonisation and the green agenda, which Lord Rooker's going to ask about another D as related to demographics, and that is, as we look ahead, Chancellor, the costs of an ageing population. Just quickly, I mean, do you think that we're going to have a reappraisal of A, the triple lock, and B, the age of retirement?
Well, you know, both those things are kept under review, but I would say probably the answer to that question is very contingent on how successfully we are in delivering the ambitions that I outlined to Lord Blackwell. So if we are able to run public services significantly more efficiently, if we are able to increase our long-term growth rate, then you know, it's entirely possible that we can continue to have the levels of public provision that we currently have and the support for pensioners, and I very much hope that's the case.
It's a really interesting answer. So what you're saying is that if we don't do that, we will have to have that kind of conversation, and therefore it is something that you're thinking. I mean, I think that we've heard consistently that there are these numerous pressures that we are going to have to confront in the next Parliament, and that indeed a number of witnesses have said that to us, one of them being what I've just said. Would you agree with that?
Well, government policy is to deliver more productive public services and a higher growth rate, and that's why we're confident that we can continue to support pensioners in the way we have been in the past.
Right. Let's move on to yes, please.
We're talking about benefits which are based on the lifetime contribution, and you're proposing to abolish the contributions. I'm not really asking, this is pie in the sky stuff, but if and when you actually do changes to contributions, that you do it in coordination with the welfare reform. The two have to fit together and shouldn't be treated as isolated.
I absolutely agree.
And indeed, just to add on that, when in the autumn the Chancellor announced that we would abolish Class 2 national insurance, which is paid by the self-employed purely to get the contribution record, it's not the one based on their profits. And as part of that abolition, we're consulting on how we ensure people continue to get, who pay voluntary Class 2 national insurance, continue to get the contribution record.
Excellent. Let's move on to the green transition. Lord Rooker.
Afternoon. The last exchange, I should declare an interest. 2000, I was the 75p pensions minister. So the double lock that came in afterwards, followed by the triple lock, would avoid that kind of problem. But I'm fully prepared to accept that it basically doesn't look sustainable. At some point, someone's going to have to look at these issues, but that's not what I'm going to ask about. I'm going into energy policy, which is a bit of a change from what you've been asked previously. And I freely admit, I don't expect you to go into the nitty-gritty detail. But what I want to be able to put to you is what Professor Dieter Helmu, of course, conducted the government's cost of energy review some years ago, said, when he said if energy policy is to be effective, the government needs to revisit its net zero objective, define it properly, and admit the costs will be a lot higher than it currently claims. Now, basically, we'd be interested to have a comment on that, but I also want to be completely open and transparent, is that Dieter Helm's November last year big essay and blog on net zero, he put the same points and levelled the same accusations of not looking at the cost properly at the opposition as he did for the government. So what's your comment on what he says about having to do this properly? It's going to cost a lot more than what's being claimed.
I don't agree, but I do accept there are uncertainties, and I think there's two things I would say. The first thing is that we have actually succeeded in decarbonising more than anywhere else. About half our economic output is being decarbonised, compared to, I think, 45% in France and Germany, 25% in Japan and the United States. So we have done better than other large economies, and we have met our carbon budgets to date. And I think that the unknown in this is the impact of technology. But I think technology can only make it cheaper as we learn how to, digitize new clean energy projects. And the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is going to be a lot of new technology which all countries will benefit from. Now, we don't know the extent to which that will happen, but I accept there is an uncertainty there. But when people talk about the costs of net zero, sometimes that comes from climate skeptics who say this is like going to bankrupt us and we should be honest about that. And sometimes it comes from climate change advocates or climate change people who think we should do more on climate change, who say that we're not being honest about what we need to do. But what I would say to both of those is that from a purely economic point of view, without getting into the debate on climate change itself, I do agree that we need to have a plan for plentiful, cheap, green energy in the decades ahead. And I think that, I'm very persuaded that one of the reasons that the United States is having much higher economic growth at the moment than Europe is because they have much lower energy costs. And for me, that says that amongst all our energy policies at the moment, the one that we really need to make sure is properly energised is our plans for nuclear, which we currently want to be providing 25% of our energy by 2050. I think that's absolutely right. But it is extremely important that that is delivered as we need it to be.
I agree absolutely with that point. Well, Detail makes this point that if we remove the loss of carbon from what we did on getting rid of coal-fired power stations, our record doesn't look anywhere near as good as what we claim it does. I know we started it all, but the fact is, the push for renewables, the better we do on that, the more we're going to need to cover the intermittency.
Yeah.
When the wind, the sun's not there. And the point is, those who are producing the so-called cheaper renewables, low marginal cost, they're not paying the costs of intermittency, which we've got to have to keep the lights on. And there's a serious problem with who's going to pay for it. It's going to be paid for. And nuclear may be one, but there may be other aspects of it. And it's this issue of, you mentioned about the climate skeptics. If we get this wrong in upsetting the public, and the public think they've been misled about it being cheap and a lot cheaper to do the future, the climate skeptics will use that in a populist way to attack the whole policy. That makes us incredibly vulnerable, I think. So we need to be more open about the actual costs of what we're surviving. I mean, the UK, Woody makes one final point. He makes the point the UK supply chains are not just fit for purpose. We've deindustrialised over 40 years. We have a lack of skills and training. We're not going to go into refining, are we? The materials that we need? Or someone's got to do it, or we're going to import it. So there's some serious issues of what we need from renewables, both from China, from cobalt, from the Congo, and other matters that we haven't got the capacity to do that. So we're going to be have to importing a huge amount at extra cost because we haven't got the industrial capacity anymore. And that's going to put the costs up. That's the central point he makes about being open with people about the true cost of net zero.
Well, there's a lot in there, Lord Rooker, but I would say that, first of all, I don't really accept this kind of thing that you hear a lot, that we've deindustrialized and we're only a service economy. We're the 12th largest manufacturer in the world. We have a very significant manufacturing base, including manufacturing half the world's large aircraft wings, and some very real strengths in our manufacturing industry, and it's a very important part of our industrial strategy. Nor do I really accept that, it's not your point, it was the point you were quoting, but that it's unfair to talk about the removal of coal-fired power stations, because that is a part of decarbonising the economy. I think where there is some legitimate point is that sometimes the reason that we've decarbonised is because we've imported products that don't count as carbon, but actually they're made with coal-fired electricity that comes from a Chinese factory, and we import that, and that doesn't count as something towards our own carbon usage. So I think that is a fair point that we need to sort out, and we're doing that with the CBAMS programme. But I think the overall point is right. I think Prime Minister Sunak has been absolutely right on this. We have to carry the public with us. They have to know that what we're doing for the green transition is proportionate and reasonable, and isn't going to see unnecessary increases in their energy bills at a time when people are very sensitive about the cost of living. So we need to tread that path carefully. I think in this country there has been quite an impressive social consensus that we need to deliver net zero. But I think if you look around the world at some of our friends in other places, they have seen that consensus fray. And that's why I think we need to be very, very careful in the way that we continue to deliver what we want to do for the climate, but in a way that ordinary people think is fair.
Thank you. Great. We're going to move on to other topics in just a moment. Let me just try and ask this final question on debt and the issues that we've been discussing. So Gerard Lyons said to us that there is a serious danger that the UK will fall into a debt trap before the end of this decade. Now, hearing you speak, Chancellor, and answering all our questions very eloquently, what I hear from you is that you don't think we're going to need to increase taxes, nor are we going to need to cut spending, but the productivity gains, especially those in the public services, will deliver the growth we need, and therefore we won't get into the debt trap. First question is that summary correct? And second, if we don't therefore hit that productivity gains and that growth, do you agree with Dr. Lyons that we actually do run the risk of falling into a debt trap before the end of the decade?
That is, with great respect, not a correct summary of my position. I think public sector productivity is a very, very important way that we will live within tight public sector budgets over the years ahead in a way that avoids cuts to the services that are valued by the public. And so it's a very important part of our programme. But in the end, public services are 20% of the economy, and it's what happens with the 80%, the private sector, that is going to be the most important in terms of avoiding falling into a debt trap. And that means we need to have a plan for long-term economic growth, and that means plans that boost investment in the economy, which is a very central focus of not just the changes to full expensing, but also the Mansion House reforms in the City of London, to our plans to grow our technology-linked sectors, to getting people back into work, all those kinds of areas. And so that is very, very important. In the budget, I was focusing on the public sector more, but that is not the thing that will stop us going to a debt trap.
I have just sparked a number of questions. So Lord Griffiths and then Lord Blackwell.
Chancellor, you've made a lot of public sector productivity. I read a speech not long ago by John Glenn, and he made a lot of how important the civil service was, and it was terrific. But it seems to me, if you're going to have an increase, a significant increase in public sector productivity, we have to reduce the size of the civil service, and probably by a significant amount. Would you say that is an unreasonable judgment?
No, and we already have plans in place to reduce the size by 66,000, which brings it to its pre-COVID levels. I think we should continue to look at ways that we can improve productivity. I think, by the way, a more productive workforce is a happier workforce. Right. And you can achieve big productivity improvements with natural wastage, not compulsory redundancies, but absolutely think we need more productivity in the civil service, yes.
Blackwell?
Going back to this long-term projection, the only numbers we have are those from the OBR, which has said project public expenditure ending up at 67% of GDP because of the decreasing or the increasing dependency ratio, the number of people in work versus people retired, etc. And you say productivity in public services is going to be important, but of course, although, as you say, only 20% of the economy is in public services, there's another 20% in pensions and welfare that isn't subject to productivity. So I wonder whether you would, in order that we can understand how this equation would work out, whether you would accept the challenge of suggesting to us what combination of higher growth rate than the OBR assumes and higher productivity growth in public services than the OBR assumes would solve this equation and allow us to believe that it is sustainable.
It's a very good question. So just a couple of things, if I may, details on what you said. First of all, I think that 67% number that you quoted has changed significantly on the basis of the OBR's latest projections, and I think it's improved a lot. But I will write to you, if I may, with updated information on that. I think that was something that was done a couple of years ago from memory. Secondly, the 20% that is on that is essentially transfer payments is absolutely an amount that you can reduce with welfare reform if you get more people back into work. I accept that pensions are going to continue to be an obligation, but there's definitely a lot that can be done to reduce the pressure on the public purse. And with respect to how much would you need to increase our long-term growth rate to in order to sustain tax at a current level of GDP. Maybe that's something I should commission the OBR to do. I'm very happy to go away and think about that because I would be very interested to know the answer that they say.
Well, it would be very helpful to have some numbers on how you might see that equation working if we're going to believe that it is sustainable. So if you were able to include that when you write, that would be very helpful.
I stand corrected on my question. But given your answer, Chancellor, can I just, sorry, but then I really will turn over to Ron Turnbull. Can I just read you what Paul Johnson said? He said this: now more than ever, as a country, we face some big decisions and trade-offs over what we want the state to do and how we're going to pay for it. Those looking to form the next government should be honest about these trade-offs. Do you agree with that outlook? And do you think that we do need this debate?
So I find it very difficult to disagree with Paul Johnson because he's someone for whom I have enormous respect. But I do disagree with that statement, yes. And the reason I disagree with it is because it's based on assumptions that things will continue in the way they always have. That it's not going to be possible for a government to live within 1% real terms growth in public spending. When I've been part of several governments that have done that, that it's not going to be possible to increase our long-term economic growth rate. And it's basically based on straight-line projections on what our economic performance has been over relatively recent years, when I'm Chancellor because I want to change that. And I want to set out how we're going to change it. And we've had a really good discussion, if I may say, this afternoon on how I plan to do it. And you've given me very fair challenge on the points I want to do. But I don't believe, as they say about investments, that the future is always, the past is always a guide to the future. And I think we can change that. And I think I'm making an argument as to how we can change it.
Great. Well,
in the report the committee produced on the Bank of England, reference was made to the extension of the remits of the bank, three of the bank's committees. Consider this and have regard to that, subsidiary objectives and so on. And we asked that this should be looked at. The reply you gave was, you said the Treasury had taken steps to simplify the most recent FPC letter. That involved taking out a reference to climate change and energy security. I think I would describe this as a light trim. And rather than trying to redraft these things now, just simply a request is, next time these things are edited, could you have a more thorough look at this and see whether there's anything more that could be pruned from this growth of words? Now, the question takes on to the next issue, which is QE and QT. Both the governor and the outgoing head of the Debt Management Office were adamant that this was a decision for the bank. It was an instrument of monetary policy. Now, some of us find this actually implausible. At the time when the bank's owning 40% of the government's debt, the government has a lot of relevant interests. The costs of debt, the way it increases vulnerability to changes in interest rates, the freedom of manoeuvre you have or generate for if there's another shock in the future, and there are big issues about impact on incomes and impact on wealth. So it seems a bit implausible that the MPC is deciding all these things, which seem to go a long way beyond monetary policy. Now, I suspect actually you have these discussions, but there's nothing. We don't get any real account of what is the nature of the decision. There's no formalisation about discussing with it whether the next move on QT is 10 billion or 100 billion. But these are big decisions with big impacts and big effects on many of the things that you are responsible for. So I wonder whether you can tell us about how exactly these decisions get taken.
Yes, and I'll bring in Sam as well to support me on that if I may. But first of all, on your first question, you gave us a very useful report saying that we should slim down the remit letter, and I accept your challenge. We've slimmed it down a bit, but we could probably do better, and I think focus is very important in these things, so I will take that away. On your second...
Sorry, Chancellor, so sorry to interrupt you, but just what led you to change the remit vis-a-vis green? I mean, what was the motive behind that? I mean, I'd love to say it's our report, but...
Well, I think we broadly agree with your report, actually. I think it did have an influence, but I think it's also important to say that, climate change objectives are very bedded into what the Bank of England has to do anyway, so it hasn't come out of it completely. But I do think when you're talking about financial stability, it's very important to have complete clarity in what the priorities are.
I just got to ask, did you think it was distracting?
I think that it is always the case that if you give people too many targets, it's the same as giving them no targets at all. That's something I learnt when I was Health Secretary with responsibility for the NHS. And so to go on to your second point, these really are decisions that are made by the Bank of England on QE and QT. There is no secret, what would you like to do, Chancellor, in this one that goes on. And I think it's important that I think it's important. We have learnt over the last year that the tools of monetary policy, the traditional tool of interest rates, is not as effective as it used to be because of the number of people on fixed rate mortgages. There's quite a big delay, and so it's important that the bank has these tools at their disposal. And I do fully accept that it's a very, very powerful tool which has a big impact. But I do think that the independence of the Bank of England has been very important in bringing down inflation and giving the markets confidence that we're bringing down inflation. And I have not wanted to undermine that. But perhaps I could bring in Sam for some other comments.
Thank you. I mean, not a huge amount to add, really. I mean, as the Chancellor says, having monetary policy be seen to be independent is hugely important. Sort of political interference there would be an enormous problem, and I think being overbearing on sort of fiscal policy objectives would be a form of that. I think it's worth remembering that monetary policy through bank rate has effects on fiscal policy by changing the path of interest rates and its effect on the real economy and the tax take and so on. So it's always been the case, even before QE and QT, that monetary policy was having a big impact on our fiscal sums. I think it's worth adding that quantitative tightening may be crystallising losses on the fiscal side, but quantitative easing had benefits, and the public purse did benefit from the quantitative easing end of the cycle. The only thing I'd add is that there's a huge degree of transparency on how QE and now QT are impacting the public finances. We have it in our Treasury annual report and accounts. The OBR put it in there, EFO and the bank have got this quarterly report on it all. So, there's a complex interaction between the cost of holding gilts and the cost of selling them. So, but the bank have done some really interesting, very, very good work on modelling the different impacts of that. They actually show that the lifetime cost doesn't change very much on different paces of unwind. And it's because holding the gilts costs you, as well as and selling them reduces the holding cost, but crystallises losses on the sales. So it's quite a complex interaction.
Lord Burns, do you want to come in?
I still find quite a lot of this conversation difficult. Quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, as we have seen, have involved some very large gains at times and some even larger losses. Given that almost every decision that one takes in public policy, you have to take account of the costs of the actions that you are taking. I find it difficult to see that one has got a policy here which can be pursued entirely for monetary policy reasons that has no consideration of the costs that might be involved in it if you make significant losses, as has happened over the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm not challenging at this point the decisions that were taken, but the idea that they should be taken entirely on monetary policy grounds without any consideration as to what the cost of them might be, I do find a difficult idea. For example, in foreign exchange, in the old days of foreign exchange intervention, it was always in the back of people's minds what the gains and what the costs might be of it. And it was, there were different, both the Treasury and the Bank of England would be involved in those decisions. The idea that this is something where the potential costs have no weight, I just find it puzzling.
I think that probably takes it, that I don't think the no weight is completely right, because there is a remit for the asset purchase facility operations, which talks about, subject to the monetary policy considerations, minimising cost and risk. So there is some sort of normal framing around minimising cost subject to the monetary policy. This is a discussion that the Treasury Select Committee has been having, and there is a response to a report of theirs due, I think, early April. That would be another opportunity to kind of revisit these questions.
It was there that I picked up some of these comments that the decisions were made entirely on monetary policy grounds and no consideration given to cost. But we will wait for maybe for the
I would just say that I think it bears a lot of thinking. There are actually some constitutional implications to your question. And I suppose the two things one should think about are, first of all, if those decisions have been under the control of chancellors rather than the Bank of England, would they have been different, with the benefit of hindsight and all those things? And the second bigger question to ask, which some people have been asking recently, is the world that I live in, which has an independent Bank of England and an OBR, better for economic policy making or worse for economic policy making than the world that Lord Lamont lived in when he was Chancellor?
Wanted to change.
And all those changes were put in for a reason. And I believe that it has been progress overall, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't improve it.
So you're saying they decided that you wanted to increase this, I think it's 100 billion is its current reduction QT figure. Want to come up with some other figure that you'd have no prior warning of it. What do you think of this, Chancellor? Do you have any concerns that we should look out for in how we do it and how we announce it? It's this idea that it's entirely them and you should stay out of it that's puzzling us.
Look, I don't pretend that I don't have my own views. I have my own views, by the way, as to whether interest rates should go up or down, but I never express them publicly because part of the deal with an independent Bank of England is that you keep those views to yourself. That's how it happens. But I will very much take away the thoughts of the committee because I think they are important things to reflect on.
Excellent. Lord Russell?
Yes, I think the implication of the answers we've just had, particularly from Sam, probably answers yes to the first question I was going to ask, which is that, indeed, I think she suggests there probably always has been a blurring of the impact of monetary policy and fiscal policy on our public finances. And I think Sam rather suggested there's always been a slight blurring there, leaving aside the decision that was up. The question asked us who takes those decisions. But if I could ask a specific question, of course, because one of the things that Sam has indicated, the effect of QE and now QT, is because of the impact of QE, the Treasury made a significant profit on the way up and is now making a significant loss on the way down as a result of the indemnity. Do you actually think that as we are the only, I think we're the only major financial central bank that does actually pay interest on all commercial bank reserves, do you think it's time for that policy to change? Professor Goodhart suggested to us that would be a good idea, and of course that would mean we wouldn't have the losses resulting from the impact of the indemnity. Now, I understand the argument on control of monetary policy. On the other hand, his suggestion would be that could be dealt with by capital ratios or liquidity ratios.
I think there would be other impacts to a decision like that. There would be particular impacts on the competitiveness of British banks and the competitiveness of the UK financial services sector. And that's why that's not something that we are currently considering. I just point out, which the committee will be well aware, that the taxes paid by the financial services sector pay for half the cost of the NHS. So it's a very, very important sector for the public purse, as well as being very strategic for the UK. But I'm very well aware of the arguments that are made in that area.
But you're not prepared to commit one way or the other?
I'm saying we're not considering doing that.
Do you want to ask about the deed of indemnity, Lord Russell? Do you want to do that now?
Yes. Well, there is the question of the deed of indemnity, which we haven't seen, and we've been told we can't see it. Is there any reason why we shouldn't?
I'm afraid there is, but it's, and I'm sorry to sort of say it in this way, but it contains little of interest, but it does contain operationally sensitive information relating to government cash management practices, which mean that we can't publish it, but it doesn't contain anything that would, I don't believe, would impact your views on the issues that we've been discussing today.
So when the governor told us there's no mystery to it, there is a bit of mystery to it. That's what you're saying.
There's a bit of mystery to it in terms of there are operationally sensitive cash management practices, right, which would be damaging to put in the public domain. But in terms of the policy issues that we've been discussing today, I don't believe there is anything significant in it.
Okay, and so it doesn't get into it. So it's operational. It's nothing to do with, as you say, policy or governance or that kind of issue.
I think that's what the governor's saying, and I would agree with that.
Is there a version that could be published?
I mean, there might be a version that's sort of redacted to hell, but then I think that would just make you even more angry. So that's the reason we don't end up in a very satisfactory place.
Only redact it really need to be redacted so that people understand. I don't think people understand this business about this long period of profit now followed by a long period of losses, and we've more or less passed the break-even point. Do people understand that? I think it's a relevant thing for people to know about. You could do that without getting into the dark arts of the DMO.
Yeah, I would just the bank do a quarterly report on which reports on how QT is going and the impacts of, for example, their change from the 80 billion per annum to the 100. And if you look there, I think you will find all the kind of detail about fiscal impacts, lifetime costs that you would want to see. I think it is very transparent and is published quarterly, so very up to date as well.
Lord Griffiths, do you want to?
Yes, Chancellor, may I just clarify in my own mind this issue of the fiscal cost of monetary policy? As I've read statements by you in the last few years, you have consistently said bringing down inflation is a prerequisite for increasing productivity and increasing growth. We've also seen the horrendous cost inflation is to the economy, not least in terms of the distribution of income and for low-income groups who have suffered severely. I've always assumed, therefore, that the fiscal cost of monetary policy was relatively small compared to the gains that we get from getting inflation under control. And therefore, in a way, it doesn't surprise Lord Burns. I think I would say that what has happened, by and large, has got the priorities right, and we are now seeing the benefits of it.
I think I agree with that. And I think, how does the sort of well-oiled ship of state work? I think the Governor of the Bank of England has his clear responsibilities under the law. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has his clear responsibilities under the law. But we're both cognizant of the fact that we need to be aligned in the public interest, and we need to be mindful of the other's responsibility. So when it comes to bringing down inflation, although it's primarily the Governor's job, what I do on fiscal policy and in my fiscal events has an impact, and it obviously would be completely stupid for me to take measures that would work against what the Governor is trying to do with inflation. But he also understands that he has an inflation target, but growth is important to the economy as well, and I think the MBC are mindful of that in their decisions, but it is a decision for them.
May I just quickly ask, sorry, before I turn to Lord Virgie, just about one point. I should have raised it probably earlier, but it's related to the APF. And the OBR points out that the private sector needs to absorb relatively high volumes of debt for a sustained period. And this is obviously alongside a lot of other governments issuing large amounts of debt. How do you view that at Treasury in terms of, does that concern you? Because it is quite a lot higher. It's peaking at 8.2% of GDP 24-25, and that compares to 2.7% of GDP 2000 to 2023. So does it concern you how much debt is being issued and how this is all going to pan out? Maybe someone else, maybe Chancellor, you'd like to answer it, or one of your colleagues?
Let me just say, and then maybe I'll bring in Sam, but it's absolutely a very important part of our budget planning process to think through the impact on markets of any decisions we make, and to make sure that we're going to be able to sell whatever debt we need to. I don't know if you want to add to that, Sam.
Yes, I mean, we have the benefit of a relatively long average maturity of our gilts, which does reduce the refinancing risk that the government would experience in terms of being able to raise debt and issue gilts the following years. So, I mean, we are way ahead of most international comparators. I think thinking about the G7 and we're at 14 years. The next longest, I think, is France at 8 years. So that does give us quite a lot of resilience in our refinancing risks. If you look at, I mean, obviously very big gilt issuance following the budget, something like 265 billion this year to be issued. But if you look at sort of cover ratios and other metrics of how successfully the Debt Management Office is managing to sell relatively high levels of gilts, they're very good. In fact, I think they improved over the past year.
Does it bother you, the relatively high foreign ownership and future, I'm reading here from the OBR again, future steady decline of defined benefit pension schemes? How does that factor into your thinking on this?
So obviously we're very, we like to think that we have got, that we balance different markets for our gilts quite carefully. We're cognizant of the defined benefit pension funds having a little bit reduced demand at the long end of the curve, and we've responded to that in this year's remit. I think in terms of foreign buyers, I think this is a good market for gilts, which are popular globally. I think there used to be a view that this was somehow hot money and could sort of desert us as a source for gilts. That just hasn't been the case. And that level of around a third of our gilt holdings there has been something that has remained a kind of strength in the diversity of our customer base.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just a couple of points. Virgie, thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. Going back to our report on the Bank of England, we of course produced that report in times of very high inflation and uncertainty in the economy, and we looked at errors were made, I mean, with other central banks as well, in thinking that the inflation was a transitory measure rather than a more permanent measure. And we discussed a lot about groupthink and lack of diversity of thought in the senior team at the Bank of England and members of the MPC. In fact, Stephen King, Chief Advisor to HSBC, told the FT there does seem to be a red carpet running from Whitehall to the Bank of England, and that is not ideal from a governance perspective, given the BOE is supposed to be independent from the Treasury. How can we increase diversity in its full sense in our appointment system at the Bank of England?
Well, I think we are making good progress. I don't want to be over defensive because there's always more that can be done, but I think the MPC is one of the few monetary policy committees globally that has external members, which I think is important, and they play a very important role. I agree, you don't want to have a sort of revolving door between the Treasury and the Bank of England because you can have groupthink. But my experience actually is that it isn't really about someone's background, it's about someone's personality. So I can think of very contrary thinkers in the Treasury who are lifelong civil servants who give very good challenge. One of them actually is Claire Lombardelli, who's just joined as Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. She was, she worked for me when I first joined the Treasury, and she was very challenging. She asked the kind of questions that you've been asking me this afternoon. So I have absolute confidence that someone like that will play a very good role in challenging groupthink. But you're right, groupthink is something that we have to guard against.
I mean, you could say that the appointment of the recent Deputy Governor came, from an ex-Treasury official. It doesn't give confidence in people in saying that we are looking at appointing people from different, who don't think like us, people who are going to challenge more. I mean, should we be broadening that the group of people we select?
I don't think Claire Lombardelli does think like us. I think she's a very independent-minded person, and that's my point, really. With that, but I think we should absolutely make sure that we are, looking at people from whatever background they have to come from to make sure that there's sufficient challenge in the system. But I think that, like as you rightly said, central banks all around the world were wrong-footed by the very exceptional circumstances that we had. And so there's a lot of learning that needs to happen. It is only a positive if we continue to make our selection process for key decision makers more diverse.
Thank you. I think with that, I'm looking to see if anyone has any other questions. No, thank you very much, Chancellor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
As well. We've gone well over our hour and a half allotted to us, so we're very grateful for you staying and answering all our questions so comprehensively. Thank you very much indeed to you all, and with that we'll end the session. Thank you.